They left me behind, my own children. They packed their bags, took my savings, and boarded a plane while I sat in the doorway of the house I built with these hands. They thought I'd sit here waiting, crying, helpless. But they forgot. Silence isn't surrender. They used my money for their vacation, but I had already used my wisdom for my freedom. When they came home, they found strangers living in my house and me watching from the sidewalk. Tell me, what would you do if the ones you raised turned you into their prey? Hello there, my friend. It's your old pal again, just a man with too many memories and a few lessons life taught the hard way. You know, people think growing old makes you invisible. They think our voices fade, that our hearts stop feeling. But age doesn't make you weak, it makes you watch. Before I tell you the rest of this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been dismissed, forgotten, or talked down to just because of your age? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story too. Because what happened to me wasn't just betrayal. It was a reminder that sometimes being quiet isn't weakness. It's the calm before a storm. I wasn't always alone. Once, this old house was alive, filled with noise, laughter, arguments, and the smell of Sunday stew. My wife, Mary, she had a way of keeping everyone together. Even when times were hard, her smile could hold the roof up better than any nails I ever used. She's been gone 10 years now, and after she passed, I tried to fill that silence with family. My children, Lisa and Eric, they became my world. Lisa, my sweet talker, always knew how to make a sad story sound like an emergency. And Eric, the logical one, until money started talking louder than his conscience. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family folks envied, close, respectful, united, but sometimes a smile hides the sharpest knife. Lisa's husband, Daniel, was always polite, too polite. The kind of man who never looks you in the eye when he's lying. I didn't trust him, but my daughter said I worried too much. And my neighbors, kind people, they used to say, "Mr. Warren, you're lucky to have such a loving family." I just nod and smile, because back then I still believed it. What no one saw was how the laughter started fading, how their visits came only when bills piled up, or how my phone rang not to ask how I was, but how much I could spare. But love makes fools of us all, and I was the biggest fool of them all, trusting the ones who'd already started counting what they'd take when I was gone. You know, I wasn't born with much. Everything I have, or had, came from long days and rough hands. I was a carpenter most of my life. Built homes for strangers while living in one that took me 30 years to finish. Every beam, every nail in this house, I set them myself. Mary would paint the walls, humming old gospel songs. I used to tell her, "This house will outlive us both." She'd just laugh and say, "Only if you don't give it away too soon." I thought she was teasing. Turns out, she saw the truth long before I did. When the kids were young, we had little, but I made sure they never felt it. I skipped meals so they could go to school, sold my truck so Lisa could go to college, worked double shifts so Eric could start his business. Every sacrifice felt worth it when I saw them smile. Funny thing about giving, it becomes a habit. You don't even notice when people stop saying thank you. This house, it wasn't just wood and brick. It was my promise to them that no matter how old I got, they'd always have a home to come back to. But promises mean nothing to people who see you as an ATM with a heartbeat. Mary's rose garden is still out back. She planted it the spring before she died. I tend it every morning. It's the one thing they never asked me to sell, maybe because they didn't see its value. That garden was our love story, growing through every season. But as the years passed, I realized something. People can wither faster than flowers when greed takes root. That house, her roses, my handswork, all of it became the currency they spent without asking. It started with something small. They always do. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day Mary would have filled with the smell of biscuits and laughter, but now it was just me and the ticking of the old kitchen clock. The family had come over for dinner, a rare occasion these days. Lisa arrived late, talking loud, perfume heavy in the air, and Eric walked in with his phone in his hand, barely looking up to say hello. I had been cooking since morning, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, Mary's recipe for gravy, trying to bring back a piece of the past. When they sat down, I waited for that old warmth to return. It didn't. Lisa wrinkled her nose as soon as she took a bite. Dad, you really need to stop cooking so much. You know, maybe it's time you get someone to help you around here. I smiled faintly and asked, You mean a housekeeper? She shrugged. Well, or a home, somewhere you don't have to worry about all this. Eric laughed softly, scrolling through his phone, muttering, Yeah, this place must be falling apart by now. I looked around the table, the same table I built by hand 40 years ago. Every dent on it had a story. Birthdays, school projects, laughter. But that day, it felt like they were sitting in a stranger's house. I told them the house was still fine, stronger than me, and Lisa smirked. Maybe it's time you stop being stubborn, Dad. You're not as sharp as you used to be. She said it like a joke, but the words hit harder than she realized. I wanted to tell her that the only reason she could afford to smile was because of the sacrifices I made when I was sharp enough to work double shifts and pay her tuition. I wanted to say that this roof she found so old had sheltered her from every storm she's ever known. But I didn't. I just sat there, nodded, and let them talk over me. I kept my hands folded in my lap and smiled when they laughed. On the outside, I looked calm. Inside, something quiet and dangerous began to stir. After dinner, I offered them tea. Lisa said they didn't have time. They had plans, dinner reservations across town. She gave me a quick hug, cold and rushed, and Eric just waved from the doorway. I stood at the window, watching their taillights fade into the dark. The dishes were still warm on the table. I remember thinking, how do you become a guest in your own family's life? That night, I washed the plates one by one, slowly, the way Mary used to. I looked at their empty seats and thought about how love turns quiet before it disappears. That's the thing about disrespect. It rarely comes screaming. It walks in quietly, sits at your table, and pretends to be love. I didn't say anything that night. Didn't confront them. Didn't raise my voice. But I remembered every word, because sometimes the things that hurt the most aren't shouted. They're whispered by the people who've stopped seeing you as someone who matters. And as I dried the last plate and turned off the kitchen light, I made a silent promise to myself. The next time they walked through that door, they wouldn't find the same old man waiting to forgive them. After that dinner, things began to change. Not all at once, but slowly, like a roof leaking drop by drop until the ceiling caves in. Lisa and Eric started visiting more often, but not because they missed me. They came with papers, questions about accounts, questions about the house. Lisa's voice always had that sweet tone, the kind people use when they want something. Dad, we're just worried about you managing everything alone, she'd say, sliding bank documents across the table. It might be easier if we helped you handle your savings. She smiled, but her eyes never did. I wasn't naive. I knew what was happening. They weren't offering help. They were taking inventory. Still, I stayed quiet. I wanted to believe there was love somewhere beneath the greed. Maybe if I kept trusting them, they'd remember who I was. The man who taught them how to walk, who stayed up at night fixing broken bicycles and broken hearts. But greed doesn't remember love. It only remembers what it wants next. One evening, Eric came by after work, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder. He looked tired, but not in the way I used to look after a day of labor. His kind of tired came from chasing money he didn't have. He leaned against the counter, asking if I'd ever thought about selling the house. The market's good right now, he said, eyes scanning the living room like a buyer instead of a son. I told him this house was all I had left of his mother. He just shrugged. Well, memories don't pay taxes, Dad. That one stung. Hard. He said it like a joke, but the silence that followed felt heavier than bricks. A week later, Lisa showed up with her husband, Daniel. He was always polite in that uncomfortable, tight-lipped way. The kind of man who shakes your hand but keeps his eyes on your watch. He started talking about smart investments and how liquidating assets could help secure the family's future. I told him the family's future was built right here, on these floorboards. He smiled and said, Exactly. That's why it's time to move forward. I could feel my late wife's picture staring down from the wall. I imagined her shaking her head the way she used to when she saw through someone's false charm. They stayed late that night, going over numbers and figures I never asked for. Lisa said, Dad, you've done enough. Let us take care of you now. And those words might have sounded kind to anyone else, but to me, They sounded like a closing door, one I hadn't realized was already locked from the outside. I started noticing small things missing. My old pocket watch that Mary gave me for our 20th anniversary, some papers from my study, even the spare keys I used to keep on the hook by the door. When I asked about them, Lisa said I was probably misplacing things again. She said it with a soft laugh, the kind that stings worse than an insult because it makes you doubt yourself. The final push came one evening when they invited me over to dinner at Lisa's place. They said they wanted to celebrate family. I went, thinking maybe we were mending things. The table was full, wine, music, their friends. I was quiet, mostly just listening. Then Daniel stood up with a glass in his hand and said, "To family, the foundation of everything we have today." Everyone cheered, but no one looked at me. Later that night, I overheard Lisa and Daniel whispering in the kitchen. "We'll transfer the money before he even notices," Daniel said. Lisa's voice lowered. "Don't worry, he trusts me completely." My chest felt heavy, but my face stayed calm. I pretended not to hear a thing. When she walked me to the car, I kissed her forehead, told her to drive safe, and smiled the way a man does when he's finally learned to stop expecting honesty. When I got home, I sat in the dark living room with Mary's picture in my hands. "You were right again," I whispered. "You said love without boundaries turns into chains." I wasn't angry. Not yet. Just tired. Tired of being useful only when they needed my name on something. But something in me shifted that night. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was pain. Or maybe it was that quiet voice inside every man who's been pushed too far. I knew the time for forgiveness had passed. The next time they tried to take something from me, they'd find out that silence can be sharper than any blade. The strange thing about betrayal is that it doesn't happen in one moment. It seeps in, quietly, like a draft under a closed door, until the whole room feels cold. I started noticing things that didn't make sense, little details that most people would have ignored. But when you've lived long enough, your instincts become sharper than your eyes. It started with a phone call. Lisa left her phone on my kitchen counter one afternoon while she went to the store. It buzzed, and before I could stop myself, I looked at the screen. A message from her husband flashed. "Did you tell him yet? We need his signature before Friday." My chest tightened. I didn't open it. I didn't have to. The words were enough to tell me something was being planned, and I was the fool standing in the center of it. That night, I went to my study, the small room where I kept my old financial papers and the deed to the house. The lock on the cabinet looked scratched. Inside, a few envelopes were missing, the ones labeled savings and insurance. My heart sank, but I forced myself to stay calm. Anger wouldn't fix anything now. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at my desk, staring at the wall where Mary's calendar still hung. The month was nearly over. Friday. The same Friday from that text message. I began to pay closer attention. Every visit after that had a pattern. Lisa's voice was softer than usual, her hugs longer, her tone rehearsed. Eric stopped showing up altogether, but he'd call to ask odd questions like, "Hey Dad, what bank did you say you use again?" Or, "Do you still keep that old savings account open?" I'd answer casually, pretending not to notice the script. A few days later, the mail came. There was an envelope with my name, but the address was typed, not handwritten. Inside was a letter from the bank, a notice about an attempted withdrawal that had been denied due to missing authorization. My signature had been forged. They'd tried once already. That was my confirmation. My trust wasn't just broken, it had been used as currency. I didn't confront them. Not yet. You don't go to war without a plan. I decided to act like I didn't know. I smiled when Lisa brought groceries. I nodded when she talked about a special surprise. She was planning. And when Daniel stopped by pretending to fix the faucet, I noticed him glancing at my study door again and again. He thought I wasn't watching. But I was. One evening, I overheard them outside on the porch. They thought I was asleep. "Once we move everything into the joint account, it'll be simple," Daniel whispered. "You'll just think the money's being consolidated for taxes." Lisa sighed. "Let's just make sure the papers are ready before the trip. I don't want any problems when we're abroad." Abroad. The word lingered. Abroad. That's when I realized what this was really about. They weren't just taking my savings, they were using it to fund their own escape. The next morning, I walked through the house like it was a crime scene, every memory suddenly feeling like evidence. The photographs, the trophies, the smell of Mary's roses, everything felt temporary, like they were already packing me away in their minds. I opened my drawer, found the last letter Mary wrote before she passed. She'd ended it with one line I'd never forgotten. "Don't let kindness make you blind." That sentence hit different now. I folded the letter, put it in my pocket, and took a deep breath. They thought I was just an old man losing track of time. But I hadn't lost track of anything. I had just found my reason to wake up. I made 2 phone calls that day, one to my lawyer and one to myself, a promise whispered under my breath. If they want to play games with my life, I'll teach them how quiet victory sounds. I found it by accident, or maybe fate finally decided to stop watching quietly. That morning, Lisa had come by with coffee and pastries, talking too fast, smiling too much. She said she just wanted to help organize my papers before their trip. I told her I'd handle it myself, but she insisted. When she left, I noticed a folder slightly out of place on my desk, the corner of a document peeking out like it wanted to be seen. I opened it. Inside was a photocopy of my property deed, my signature forged at the bottom, right next to Daniel's neat handwriting. The document wasn't finished yet, just a draft, but I could see exactly what they were planning. It transferred partial ownership of my house for family management and security. They were preparing to take everything, legally. My hands trembled, but I didn't panic. I looked closer. Attached to the back was an email printout. Daniel had sent it to some real estate broker. "Once we finalize the deed and he signs, we'll be ready to list by midsummer. My own home. The one I built for my wife, the one I poured every year of my life into. They were planning to sell it while I was still living in it." I sat back in my chair, the paper shaking in my hands. My first instinct was to confront them, but then I heard Mary's voice in my head again, soft but firm. "Don't fight them with anger. Win with silence." So I folded the document carefully and slid it into the back of my old photo album. That album was full of smiles and lies, and now it had one more secret. I didn't call them. I didn't tell the bank. Not yet. Instead, I started writing everything down: dates, names, amounts, words I overheard. I even left my old recorder on the shelf, disguised as a broken radio, capturing their conversations when they came by. They'd forgotten who taught them how to hide wires inside walls. That night, I listened to one recording. Daniel's voice came through clear. "Once the funds transfer, we'll tell him the bank froze it. He won't understand a thing." Lisa laughed softly. "He'll just think it's some system delay. By the time he figures it out, we'll be gone." I turned off the tape, sat there in the dark, didn't say a word. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that every lie they spoke had already written my revenge for me. I kept the papers, the recordings, the proof, all of it hidden. Not for the police, not for court, for me. For the day I'd finally stopped being the man who forgave everything. The day they left for their vacation would be that day. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something, my friend. If you found proof, real proof, that your own blood was planning to steal from you, what would you do? Would you confront them right there at the table? Would you shout, demand answers, throw the papers in their faces? Or would you do what I did? Sit in silence, let them think they'd already won, and wait for the right moment to turn the game around? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. The quiet before justice arrives. Now, let me show you how I turned that silence into something they never saw coming. It happened the following Sunday. Lisa called, saying they wanted to have dinner together before their trip. She said it like it was a gift, a favor to an old man they were leaving behind. I knew what it really was. One last chance to get my signature. So I agreed. I set the table myself that evening. The same table where we used to celebrate birthdays and anniversaries. The same table Mary once covered with roses every Valentine's Day. I laid out my best plates, the ones with the small cracks that told a story of years gone by. If this was going to be their stage, I wanted them to perform it in the home they were so eager to sell. They arrived all smiles, the kind that don't reach the eyes. Lisa kissed my cheek, Daniel brought wine, and Eric followed behind with his usual half-hearted greeting. We sat down, and for a while, they pretended everything was fine. We talked about their trip, the weather, the price of groceries. Small talk, small lies. Then Daniel cleared his throat. "Dad," he said, his tone all politeness and poison, "before we leave, we just need to finalize a few details. For your safety, of course." Lisa placed a thin folder on the table. "It's just routine paperwork," she said, "to make sure everything's in order while we're away." I looked at the folder, then at them. The way Daniel's hand rested on the papers told me everything. They wanted me to sign right then and there, the final stroke that would make their theft complete. I could feel the tension in the air. The way Lisa glanced at her husband, the way Eric looked away, pretending not to know. "You trust us, don't you, Dad?" she asked. Her voice had that mix of guilt and arrogance I'd come to recognize. I smiled, slowly. "Of course," I said. "I always have." Daniel slid the pen across the table. It stopped just short of my hand. The silence was thick enough to cut. I picked it up, turned it between my fingers, and said quietly, "You know, your mother used to say the truest things were never written down. They were lived." Lisa forced a laugh. "Dad, you're overthinking again. It's just paperwork." "I'm sure it is," I said. Then I set the pen down. "But I think I'll let my lawyer take a look first, just in case." The room changed. The air went cold. Daniel's smile faltered. Lisa's eyes widened, her hand tightening around the glass of wine. Eric muttered something under his breath, something like, "You don't need to make this complicated." I leaned back in my chair. "I've spent a lifetime being careful, son. That's why I still have something left to steal." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Lisa stood up too quickly, her voice trembling between anger and panic. "We're just trying to help you, Dad. You always make everything so difficult." I looked at her, really looked, and saw it for what it was. Not concern, not love, just frustration that her plan was slipping through her fingers. I stood up slowly, my cane steady in my hand. "You should get some rest before your big trip," I said. "Wouldn't want to miss your flight." Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but I was already walking toward the door. "I'll keep these papers safe," I added, tapping the folder with my hand. "Wouldn't want them getting lost." When the door closed behind them, I could hear Lisa's voice breaking outside. A mix of anger and fear, but I didn't listen. I'd heard enough lies for one lifetime. I locked the door, leaned against it, and let the silence fill the room. I wasn't angry anymore. I was calm, cold, focused. They thought I'd been cornered. They had no idea they'd just stepped into the trap I'd been building for weeks. 2 days later, they came back. They said they'd forgotten something important, but I knew better. When greed fails once, it always tries again. Lisa stood on the porch, her smile stretched too wide. Daniel followed, holding a briefcase like a man bringing bad news in a suit. "Dad," Lisa said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. "We just wanted to make sure we cleared things up before the trip. You know? So you don't worry." She tried to sound light, but her eyes kept flicking toward my study door, the same one where the folder had disappeared to. "Cleared up what, exactly?" I asked, voice even. Daniel opened his briefcase, pulled out another stack of documents. "Just updates for the property insurance, a few small adjustments," he said smoothly. "There's a letter from the bank too. You'll need to sign it before Friday." I took the papers without looking at them. I could feel the heat rising in the room, their nervous energy bouncing off the walls. "Before Friday, huh?" I said softly. "Funny. Seems like everything in this family needs to happen before Friday." Lisa blinked. "What do you mean?" I met her eyes. "Oh, just something I read the other day. About signatures, transfers, and families who like moving things around while pretending it's for love." The color drained from her face. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. Daniel stepped in quickly. "Dad, you're misunderstanding." "Am I?" I cut him off. My tone was still calm, steady, the kind that makes liars sweat. "Because I received a very interesting letter myself. That came straight from the bank. It mentioned an attempted withdrawal from my account, one I never approved." Lisa froze. Eric, who'd been pretending to check his phone, looked up slowly. "That must be some kind of mistake," he said, his voice tight. "Maybe," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "But you know what they say about mistakes. They always tell you who's really paying attention." I slid the papers back into Daniel's briefcase, careful and slow. "I'm not signing anything today," My lawyer's reviewing a few matters, and I'm sure he'll have questions. Lisa's voice trembled now. Dad, we didn't mean to. I stopped her with a look. The same look I gave her when she was a child and tried to lie about breaking something that wasn't hers. Save your breath, I said. We all need our energy for the trip ahead. Daniel cleared his throat. What trip? Yours, of course, I said, turning toward the window. Don't you have a flight to catch? I could see their reflections in the glass, panic flickering just beneath the surface. They knew I knew something. They just didn't know how much. That was the moment they lost control. The first crack in their confidence. And I didn't need to raise my voice or threaten anything. Just a few quiet words, one folded letter, and their whole plan began to tremble. I watched them leave again, their smiles gone this time, and I whispered to myself, Mary, the storm has started. They left 2 mornings later. The sound of their car pulling out of the driveway was the sweetest silence I'd heard in years. I stood by the window, watching as the taillights disappeared, just like they always do, leaving behind the man they thought was too weak to matter. What they didn't know was that the night before they left, I'd been busy. I sat at my desk, the same one they tried to claim with forged signatures, and I signed my own papers. Real ones. The ones my lawyer and I had prepared quietly, weeks before. The house, the savings, every account in my name, all legally transferred and protected under a trust that no one but me and the lawyer could touch. The final clause was simple. Upon my death, all assets are to be donated to the veterans' home in Mary's name, not a cent to the children who treated me like a transaction. But that wasn't the twist. Not yet. That morning, as they loaded their luggage into the car, Lisa hugged me, her perfume choking the air. Don't worry about anything, Dad. Just rest, she said sweetly. I smiled. I planned to, I answered. And I meant it. When the door shut, I turned the key in the lock, once, twice, and walked through the house one last time. The walls felt lighter now, like they knew freedom was coming too. I touched Mary's old quilt, still draped over the couch. You were right again, I whispered. It's time to let go. That afternoon I met George, my lawyer, at the office downtown. He slid a stack of stamped documents across the table. Everything's finalized, Warren. The sale closes in 2 days. You'll receive confirmation when the new family moves in. I nodded. Good people? The best, he said. A young couple with 2 kids. Reminds me of you and Mary back in the day. I smiled. Then it's going to the right hands. Before I left, I opened my briefcase and handed George a small USB stick. Keep this somewhere safe, I said. What's on it? Proof, I said simply. Recordings, letters, enough to tell the truth if anyone ever tries to twist it again. That was the ace. The quiet weapon. Every word they'd whispered behind my back, every forged document, every conversation about selling my house was recorded and stored. I'd left 1 copy with George and another sealed in my safe deposit box. They could destroy everything else, but they couldn't erase their own voices. 2 days later, the sale went through. The locks were changed. The keys were handed to the new owners, a kind, hardworking family that reminded me what decency used to look like. And then I waited. A week later, my phone rang. Lisa's number. I didn't answer. I wanted the silence to greet her before I did. Hours later, she called again, this time crying, yelling, confused. Dad, what happened? We can't get into the house. There are people living there. They say it's theirs. I walked outside, stood across the street, and watched as their car pulled into the driveway, the same driveway they thought belonged to them. Lisa jumped out first, banging on the door. Daniel shouted, waving his phone, trying to call someone, anyone, but it was no use. The new owners stood calmly on the porch, holding their signed deed. I stepped forward, cane steady, voice even. You enjoyed your trip? I asked. Lisa turned, her face pale. Dad, what did you do? I looked past her, at the house. I did what you couldn't. I took care of our home. Daniel snapped. You can't do this. This is our house. No, I said quietly. It was mine. And you sold that trust a long time ago, the day you decided money mattered more than family. Lisa's knees gave out. She dropped onto the grass, crying, repeating my name like it might change something. Eric stood frozen, his voice small for once. You planned this, I nodded. I planned it the day I realized my kindness had become your opportunity. The neighbors were watching by then, the same ones who used to call us the perfect family. Now they stood in silence as the truth settled in. The mighty children, reduced to begging on their own father's lawn. I took one last look at the house, my life's work, and said softly, "Mary would have loved the roses. They're blooming again." Then I turned away, leaving them with nothing but their guilt, and the sound of a lock clicking that would never open for them again. The silence that followed was louder than any argument we'd ever had. Lisa knelt on the lawn, hands shaking, whispering, "Dad, please, you can't do this to us." Her voice cracked, thin and trembling, the kind of voice that used to make me want to fix everything. Not anymore. Daniel stood behind her, his confidence drained, his phone still in his hand, but he'd stopped pretending to call anyone. There was no one left to call. Eric just stared at me, pale, stunned, as if he'd just met me for the first time. "All these years," I said quietly, "I gave you everything because I believed love could fill the gaps that greed leaves behind. But you taught me something else, that peace only comes when you stop letting people take pieces of you." Lisa covered her face. "You tricked us," she said. I shook my head. "No, you tricked yourselves. You thought my silence meant I was blind, but I saw everything." Daniel's voice was barely a whisper now. "You can't just erase us." "Erase you?" I said softly. "No, son, you erased yourselves the day you forged my name." A breeze passed between us, and for a moment, no one spoke. Even the neighbors stayed quiet, standing on their porches, pretending not to watch, but unable to look away. The truth had settled, heavy and undeniable. "You'll regret this," Eric muttered. I turned toward him. "No, I already did, for years, but not anymore." The new owners, the young couple, stood on the porch, unsure what to do. I nodded to them. "Take care of the place," I said gently. "It's yours now. Treat it better than we did." The woman smiled softly. "We will, sir." As I walked past my children, I didn't feel anger, just a strange kind of peace. They had destroyed themselves, and I didn't have to lift a finger. Every lie, every forged document, every cruel word had led them to this moment, their own undoing. Lisa tried one last time. "Dad, please, where will we go?" I stopped, looked her straight in the eyes. "The same place you left me." "This top," I said quietly. "Wherever that is." She dropped her gaze, tears rolling down her cheeks. But I didn't stop to watch. Justice doesn't need an audience. It only needs truth. I reached the sidewalk and took one last look at the house. Sunlight spilling across the windows, the sound of children laughing inside. For the first time in years, it felt alive again. I breathed out slowly and whispered, "Order restored." Then I walked away, cane steady, back straight. My silence no longer a wound, but a weapon that had already done its work. As I walked home that evening, the sun was setting low, painting the sky the color of old promises. I thought about everything that had happened, not with anger, but with clarity. You spend your whole life teaching your children about respect, truth, and loyalty. But somewhere along the way, they forget that those lessons apply to you too. I learned that patience isn't about waiting quietly. It's about knowing when silence speaks louder than shouting. I learned that respect means protecting your peace, even from the people who share your name. And I learned that truth doesn't need defending. It just waits for the right moment to stand on its own. Love your family, yes, but never let love blind you to disrespect. Because when people mistake your kindness for weakness, that's when you remind them, gently, quietly, who taught them strength in the first place. Thank you, my friend, for staying with me through this story. I know it wasn't easy to hear. Betrayal never is. But sometimes the hardest stories are the ones that help us see our own strength. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if it were you? Would you have stayed silent like I did, or confronted them right away? I want to hear your thoughts. Because every story like mine has a lesson that reaches further than one home, one family, or one mistake. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to stand up for your peace. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Stories about truth, dignity, and the kind of justice that doesn't need shouting to be heard.